14 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few defense DST units I would drop this week. The first one, the Philadelphia Eagles. So the Eagles here, they've had great matchups over the last 2 weeks here. Giants and the Jets, but they really haven't gotten the job done. Week 11 versus New Orleans, 29 points allowed, 2 wins, a fumble recovery, and a touchdown. Week 12 at the Giants in that ball game, they didn't do much, 13 points allowed and a sack. And then week 13 at the Jets in a victory, 18 points allowed, 2 sacks, and an intho. So right here, they're not really putting up fantasy points. They're not really getting the turnovers like they did in weeks 8 to 11 here for the most part, is Philadelphia. Now they go on bye week, and there's no reason, in my opinion, to stash a defense here, especially on a bye, and especially in make-or-break games for a lot of fantasy owners. I know they have good matchups in week 15 and week 16, but right now, with week 14 coming up in the bye, there's no reason to stash them, in my opinion, unless you got the room, but most fantasy owners really don't. The next defense I would drop this week is the Indianapolis Colts. So the Indianapolis Colts here, another team going on bye week this week, and they got a tough matchup coming up as well over the next few weeks here, is Indy, where they might not even be usable after their week 14 bye. They got New England in week 15, who I know isn't the greatest of offenses, but they only give up the 8th least amount of fantasy points to defenses. And then week 16, the high-powered Arizona Cardinal offense in Arizona, where I could see that ball game being a shootout. So the last few weeks here for Indy, they've been pretty solid. I'm not going to doubt that. Week 11 at Buffalo, 15 points allowed, a sack, 3 intos, a fumble recovery. Week 12 versus Tampa, 38 points allowed, 2 sacks, an into, and a fumble recovery. And then week 13, a nice shutout at the Texans with 4 sacks, an into, and a fumble recovery. So they had a huge fantasy day with 25 fantasy points in most leagues was Indianapolis. But right now with the bye and 2 tough matchups coming up, there's no reason I would stash this defense. And the third and final defense I would drop this week is the Minnesota Vikings. So going into last week, I said the Vikings were a 1-week pickup on the waiver wire last week. And they really didn't have a horrible game, but they lost that game as well versus the Detroit Lions. So the last few weeks here for Minnesota, week 11 versus Green Bay, 31 points allowed, 2 sacks. Week 12 at San Francisco, 34 points allowed, 2 sacks, an into, and a kick return touchdown. And then week 13 at Detroit, 29 points allowed, 3 sacks, an into, and a fumble recovery. So in most leagues, they only had 8 fantasy points. And right now, they're owned in 71% of fantasy leagues after getting added in 54% of leagues going into week 13. But right now, this Minnesota team, they're not really doing much on defense. They're definitely struggling. And the next few weeks, they don't have the greatest of matchups. Week 14 versus Pittsburgh, it could go either way. And week 15 at Chicago, I could see Chicago putting up points like Detroit just did versus this Viking defense. So right now, I would just cut my losses and drop the Vikings. So that's a few defense DST units I would drop here for week 14 of the fantasy football season.